They are the people who will likely decide this election, but they're still weighing up who to vote for. Tonight, undecided voters are asking the questions. Could they shake up politics as we know it? Welcome to Q&A. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm Stan Grant. We're coming to you live from Sydney tonight. Joining me on the panel, youth researcher at ANU's School of Politics, Intifar Chowdhury, the creator of some of Australia's most powerful, scary ad campaigns, Siimon Reynolds, Minister for Communications and the Arts, Paul Fletcher, Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, Catherine King, and lawyer and political commentator, Caroline de Russo. Please make them all feel welcome. We've got an audience of predominantly undecided voters here with us, and tonight they'll have the chance to shape that discussion. A little later we'll bring you a special performance as well to lift our spirits as we get to the tail end of the election campaign from Vicar and Linda Ball. Now remember, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda, as usual, is the hashtag. Please get involved. And our first question tonight comes from Sam Glenn.
Hi. I'm just wondering, why is politics still a race to the bottom?
What a way to start. Intifar, is it a race to the bottom?
No. It is a race for the top, that I know for sure. But a lot of people do end up in the bottom because of people for that race at the top.
Mm. You do a lot of work with youth and youth voting patterns and doing research into that. Is there a disillusionment with, you look at the recent debate, or not the last one, but say the one on Sunday night, which was fairly vigorous, some would say a slanging match, but what do young people take away from the way that politics is conducted during an election campaign?
Young people are disappointed, straight up, disappointed, disenchanted. That, however, according to my research, does not mean that young people do not care about politics. That is a negative stereotype. From my research, I know that young people deeply care about politics and are also involved and care about issues political issues. But at the same time, they are disappointed and they feel failed by the political system and the people who are running the system at the moment.
Caroline, when you look at the debates, were you disappointed? Is that a word that would come to mind for you?
I'll be really honest. I watched parts of some of them. I actually can't sit through the whole lot.
Why?
There were bits that I muted. Well, I actually found that it didn't get me any further than I already was. I did think the second debate did get a little too antsy, and I actually don't think that it adds to the conversation. I don't like the speaking over the top of each other and that sort of thing. So I've watched bits and pieces of the debate. I tend to do that afterwards, but I just don't really think they add a whole heap of value, to be perfectly honest.
And you are a Liberal Party member,
yeah,
right?
I am,
but
correct.
Did that also flow to your side of politics? Your disappointment extended to the Prime Minister as well?
Well, I think it is with the discourse in general. For me, it doesn't attach to any one person or any one party. It's just the kind of nature of it, and it does affect me, I suppose, to some point. But a lot of people who are not necessarily in the tent like I am, they look at it and they just go, what is this that we're all paying for? They look at it, they don't necessarily see that people in Canberra, in this case, necessarily reflect them or reflect their values, and then so people disengage. And that there isn't helpful for anyone.
Siimon, there's a lot of undecideds in the room. I understand you're undecided coming into this election. If you looked at the debates and this idea of a race to the bottom, as if we play to the lowest common denominator, did that in any way help make up your mind about which side you may vote for?
It did not, and the primary reason, I think, is because discerning the differences between the two parties is becoming harder and harder. There's no radical policies being delivered for safety reasons by Liberal or Labor, because they don't want to alienate various constituencies. So what that does is forces everybody in the middle, and no matter how eloquent or bashing you are in your approach, it doesn't change the fact that you're not saying fundamentally different things.
So that's the issue with you. It's the differentiation rather than maybe the behaviour, or maybe lowballing the public, or appealing to the lowest common denominator or the worst possible instincts. I mean, that would, this race to the bottom would imply those things. For you, it's more about differentiation.
It is, because I'm very used to how politicians have been. Is this election really, take the details out of it, is the election, the fight between the two primary parties, is it any different from the last election or the election before? The election before that, it'll go back 15, 20 years. Is it any different? To the typical person, the public, like myself, it's all the same.
Catherine, a bit of a pox on both houses, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and look, I do want to say thanks, Sam, for the question. It's actually a really good question in terms of the way in which the political discourse is happening and the way in which the election's happening. Politics is about a contest of ideas, and both sides feel really passionately about those ideas. How we express those in the context of an election campaign, particularly now when we've got so many different forms of media through which that expression is made, is really difficult. And I think trying to make sure we actually get those ideas across and inspire people, I think is, it's tough in the environment that we're in, but that is our job. That is very much our job, to try and say, this is our contest, this is where we believe we want to change the country and make it better. I think the debate formats, I think it's really disappointing that there's not been a debate at the National Press Club. I think it's disappointing there hasn't been a debate on the ABC, or the Prime Minister hasn't come on this program, the national broadcaster. It's extraordinary. That is important, and I think, we've seen with the different tone of the three debates, I think probably, the latter debate really sort of allowed that contest of ideas, and that's really, I think, my experience of what people are wanting for. What is it that you're actually wanting to do? How are you going to change the country? What's your idea for the world? And that's really the thing that we hope inspires people, but it's been a little, tough the last few years to be able to get those messages out.
Can I just ask, just a show of hands, if you will, do you agree with Sam's proposition here that it's a race to the bottom? Is disappointed in what we've seen so far? Just hands up if you are. Ooh. Poor Fletcher, that's not a vote of great sort of faith in the political process or behaviour, is it?
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is communicating complex ideas in a compressed timeframe is challenging, and that's a challenge that faces both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. But also, a significant part of political communication is trying to convey some of the facts, I guess. So, when we've been critical of the Leader of the Opposition for his comments about that wages should increase by 5.1% to match the rate of inflation, what we're trying to explain is that there is an independent body, the Fair Work Commission. There's a good reason why there's an independent body that makes those decisions. But that's quite a complicated argument to get across. What I find is, as a politician, you communicate in many different contexts, certainly on television, but, both Catherine and I were talking about it just now, we're spending a lot of time on pre-poll. So you're standing there, people come up to take the how to vote. Now, the numbers are not as intense or large as on polling day. You're often having conversations with people, or if you're standing there with your sandwich board or whatever it is, very often the conversation is first about, OK, here are some factual aspects of the issue before you can even get into the advocacy. So the point I'm making is it's complex, it's complicated, and trying to communicate those messages to then a whole range of people with different levels of interest and engagement. It's a complex communication challenge.
But at the end of the day, that is our job. That is our job. And if we're not doing that in the way that is inspiring people, then, we have to think about that and think about how we do better at that all the time. I think, the debate formats help that, but I think certainly, the way in which we communicate and get those ideas to people. And I think also people post-COVID are pretty tired. They've seen, Caroline and I were talking about it before, seen Polly's up on television all the time, just talking, and you're tired and want to get on with your lives a bit. So how we communicate in that context, we also have to think about it. And it is, for me, in my own constituency in Ballarat, it's those one-on-one conversations that's the best way to do it, really.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that issue of wage increases as well, so we'll keep that thought in our minds. Our next question comes from Rebecca Mann.
Hi, everyone. In this election, so many political adverts are deliberately misleading and some even patently dishonest. Following this election, do you think that the incoming government should amend some of the laws surrounding political advertisement?
Siimon, I'll go to you on that.
Well, my personal view is absolutely. I think it's outrageous that the whole rest of the advertising industry, if they say something even slightly inaccurate about a beer, let's say it's got vitamin A in it and it doesn't have vitamin A, they are going to be fined, they're going to be slammed, it's going to be taken off air. But that's a trivial issue. What about the whole country's future? They're allowed to say what they like. I think it's absolutely crazy. Now, one of the reasons I feel that they're allowed to is it looks so difficult to police it. How would you stop them? And I think that's the challenge, is if I'd love to see some kind of body, perhaps 3 federal judges looking at each ad prior to it going and giving a tick off that it seems like it's right for the nation to see, something like that. But it needs some kind of body to oversee this advertising.
We're going to talk as well about the effectiveness of ads, and of course you're well known for one very effective ad. If you're of my age, you'd certainly remember this ad. For those not, let's have a little look.
But now we know every one of us could be devastated by it. The fact is, over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead.
My question is for Paul Fletcher.
Oh, not yet. My question is for Paul Fletcher, but we'll come to that in just a minute. Siimon, when you look at that, that was a very effective ad, but it was designed to scare us as well. How, when we talk about political advertising, what is that sweet spot between information and message and impact?
That's a great question. And the reality is this, that if you look at either side's advertising, it's information-led, but it doesn't really have the emotion that I feel that advertising should have. Now, there's a presumption, I think, in the marketing of both parties that we're all very interested in what they've got to say. And don't get me wrong, I mean, you know, I truly am a fan of politicians in general. I think the vast majority got their heart in the right place. They work exceedingly hard, having watched them up close. But the truth is that Australians aren't that fascinated with this election most of the time. The truth is that we're as worried about our daughter's cold or our azaleas growing dead, or the fact that, you know, I'm hungry and I want to have dinner while we're watching these ads. And therefore these ads fail, in my view, because they inform but they don't impact.
Does fear win over hope?
It does in general. In fact, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman showed that it is almost 2 times as powerful to talk about fear. Fear of loss aversion, as he called it, is much more impactful. So, as an example, you would be much more motivated to avoid losing $1,000 than you would be at the possibility of gaining $1,000. So, a lot of the political ads are talking about a rosy future, and I can understand why, because you don't want to be all misery guts when it comes to your advertising. But at this late stage, when we're trying to persuade undecideds, I think fear is a much stronger way of doing that.
Intifar, are youth looking for fear or hope?
I actually would take a step back, and I actually disagree. I don't think it's about fear or hope at the moment for young people. I feel like young people are more critical at this. Today's young people are more critical than their parents, let's say, or their grandparents. And they understand misinformation or disinformation, or they understand what's happening. I think they're just after the truth, the reality, integrity. That's what they're after. Even when I turn on the TV, well, I don't turn on the TV, let's say when I'm on the internet.
You're on TV tonight.
Yeah, I am on TV today. But when I'm on the internet, these ads, they are deterring. They deter you from politics.
That's really interesting too, because how you get your information is different. As you say, not on television. My children are the same. They'll be watching it on the internet. They'll be watching clips on YouTube or Facebook.
Little
or
bites, absolutely. So I think the most important thing is who is the audience? And I tell this to my political science students as well when they write an essay. Like, when you're communicating, you want to think about who your audience is, and you want to learn about your audience and the amount, what cognitive resources they have. Probably that ad that we saw probably would have made people afraid at that time. Right now, I see it and I do a massive eye roll. I just go like, you think this is gonna work? I mean, this is true. Well, at least for my generation, it's true. Well, half of us don't even turn on the TV.
Well, for those of us who were there in the 80s, it did work, let me tell you.
That's what I'm saying.
Thank goodness it did, but it does look pretty dated. Yeah.
I'm saying that it probably
People are looking
did
for something
work.
different.
Yeah, I think
it probably worked, but
just...
not now, not this generation.
Well, we could just get Morrison bowling down Albanese.
Oh, there you go. Why didn't you think of that, Paul Fletcher?
Can I just pick up something that Siimon said there, which was quite important, I think. He made the point that for quite a lot of people, political issues are not top of mind. And the flip side of that is, as you know, is well known, a significant percentage of people don't make a decision until they actually have the how to vote card in their hand and are going in to cast their vote. Part of that is a corollary of the fact that we have a compulsory voting system in Australia. Our system is quite different to other countries where the aim is to get the vote out, so you're appealing to the extremes. Our system tends to focus on the mainstream and people who may not be that engaged, and I think that's a plus in our system. But I think it's one of the reasons why sometimes you can see messaging which is designed to be cut through and getting to people who may not be having that much of a focus.
Should you be allowed to lie in ads, though? To Simon's first point, if you're selling toothpaste or beer, you can't, but if you're selling politics, you can.
The issue here is the implied freedom of political communication, which the High Court has found is inherent in the Constitution. And then the question of, OK, if you're going to put any restrictions on political communication, who would actually be making those decisions, and would they effectively be standing in the shoes of the electorate? You know, ultimately in our system...
but a lie is a lie, right? I mean, if you're lying to someone...
But if you stand or fall on the claims you make and whether they're effectively rebutted, and it's the electorate that ultimately makes that decision. And if one party says something, the other party, if it believes it's incorrect, has a very strong incentive, the means and motivation to get out there and say, well, that's not true, this is the truth.
Catherine, you know, according to the polls, you may even be in office after the election. Would you look? Is that something that Labor would want to look at seriously?
There's a couple of things. I want to take up Simon's point. Like, you know, seriously, you can't honestly tell me there's no puffery in advertising. So, you know, really, like, there's issues about, you know, obviously you can't make a health claim in advertising because that has some very serious consequences if you're trying to make a claim about that, and that's why there's regulations around that. I think people are really discerning, and the example I use, and I think Paul and our kids are similar ages. I have a 13-year-old, you know, watching YouTube, TikTok all the time, and he has been absolutely inundated with Palmer United ads. You know, I think they're just everywhere, and he you know, says, like, why are people believing, you know, this rich billionaire? You know, why are they being conned by this bloke? And, like, he's 13, he can work it out. I think people are pretty smart and they see everything through a lens of, this is someone trying to persuade me about something. Is it true or is it not true?
So they think so little of politicians, they accept they lie all the time, and so you don't need a law against them.
No, that's not what I'm saying, Stan. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is people have a discernment about what they're seeing. You know, they make put it through a lens of their own lived experience, and they make those decisions and use critical thinking skills. Now, obviously, you know, advertising is exactly that. We are trying to persuade of a particular thing. We're trying to say, you know, our side is better. Of course it is, but our side's better, and this is what we're going to do about it. So I think, you know, facts do matter, but I think also, you know, I think people are pretty discerning about it, and, you know, we leave it to the electorate to make up their mind about those things.
Caroline.
I look at it from a legal point of view, and obviously I've done a lot of corporations law. If you make a misleading or deceptive claim to the market and it has a material impact on the share price, ASIC visiting you pretty quickly, and we've seen a lot of that sort of thing play out in the courts over the years. And I do appreciate Catherine's point. How do you actually regulate this if you do go to regulate it? It's the sort of thing where you would do the draft and you would as easily tear that draft apart and try it again and never really come up with something that balances it well. So I always take the view of I'd prefer more speech than less speech, and to the extent that it can be rebutted, that is obviously the preference. The thing where it can be really impactful is, well, one, does it have an impact? And two, at what stage of the campaign is it? I mean, if you were seeing that, it's always the last week of the campaign that this stuff sort of comes out where there's almost no opportunity to rebut it, where if it is effective, that's where it can be a problem. And we saw that, I suppose, in a sense with the Mediscare in 2016, that there was pretty reasonably effective. And the coalition still hasn't scrapped Medicare. So, that they can be problematic.
Well, I hate to be cynical, but lawyers, journalists, politicians and advertisers, I don't know if any of us
I know, right?
Intifar, you're excluded tonight, researchers. Our next question comes from Claire Reynolds, mate.
Hi, so my question is, what will my future be? Will I be able to survive with the cost of living and be able to buy a house? And will we be able to do something about climate change?
Paul Fletcher.
Well, we've certainly got plans to deal with all those things. So we're committed to net zero emissions by 2050, and of course Australia's emissions are already 20% down on 2005 levels, so that's ahead of New Zealand, Canada and the US. In terms of being able to buy a house, we've got a whole series of programs to deal with housing affordability, our housing guarantee scheme, the $25,000 a home builder program, where we've had 137,000 families take advantage of that. So we're very focused on how we can support people, and including younger people, getting into buying a house. And then in terms of cost of living, obviously we've included in the budget measures like the 6-month halving of fuel excise, which saves a typical family about $600 over that time, as well as measures like the low and middle income tax offset, $1,500, and that'll be up to $1,500, and that'll be available from 1 July this year. So we've taken a series of measures in the budget to deal with cost of living challenges, but what we also want to focus on is continuing to build a strong economy. Unemployment now at 4%, we think it can go lower, and obviously one of the most effective ways to make sure that as many people as possible are able to deal with cost of living challenges is to have as many people as possible in a job, and that's something we're very focused on. Our policies are designed to achieve.
And Catherine, clearly there's a question here about a sense of hope as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think Claire's point goes to, what's my future going to be? And, hopefully it'll be one where you're a future leader in some way and being able to actually, show some of us the way as well. But I think, that is, goes into the stuff about what are young people particularly interested in this, not just this election campaign, but, about what their futures are. And it is about, will I actually be able to have the lifestyle that I want, but also those really big issues about climate change. And I think you can have an economy that addresses the climate that actually also, creates the environment where, power prices through renewables are actually cheaper. And that's really what we've been talking about through the Powering Australia plan, through our Rewiring the Nation plan, is really about that, about we can't sit back and waste another decade of actually not dealing with these issues. And I think that's been the problem with the Morrison government, is that we've had almost a decade where, they keep telling us that, we've got all this, we've got this climate change thing, and they clearly do not. And I think that's what people are looking for, is some change around that.
Claire, can I just come back to you? And I know your dad's sitting with you, Peter, tonight as well. Is it that what you're hearing from the major parties doesn't resonate? I mean, you know all of the policies, Claire, but what's not resonating with you?
With me, sorry.
Yeah.
I think it's just that for me, I know that inflation has gone up and the minimum wage has not. And I think that's a big deal. And I think there's a lot of false promises when it comes to climate change. And I think being have being net zero by 2050. I think that's what you said. I feel like we can do it a lot sooner, and a lot of other countries have done it sooner. And I feel like we can do better.
Peter, what are the... What are the sort of conversations that you have with Claire and about her future, and what concerns do you hold?
Well, I'm a school teacher as well, so I have conversations with all the young people that I see, with Claire, and my worry is exactly that the promises are there, 2050, 0%, but I'm looking at the last 3 months. I mean, it's just been rain, rain, rain. I've got sick, Claire's got sick, we never get sick. And I'm thinking, what's our future going to be, or what's her future going to be in the future of young people? And I think it's very, very nice to have things in place. But yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's just not working.
What's different, do you think, from when you may have been Claire's age and what Claire is facing when she looks at her future?
Well, when I was Claire's age, which is a long, long time ago, I mean, we just never bothered about climate change, and things like that. But we still had the same problems of inflation and things like that, but we overcame it. Didn't seem as bad as it does now.
Intifar.
I think I actually resonate with Claire's point. 2050 is quite down the road. I think I'll be 50 if I'm still around. If climate change doesn't kill me. I think to politicians, I always look at the 2050 targets, and I think about how about a target when you're still going to be around? Because if you don't reach the target, I have to face the consequences. You probably don't. So an earlier target would probably resonate with younger people better. And then I'll probably go back to your question about the future. These youth issues have been around for a very long time. 2004, for example, housing affordability was identified as a crisis. Home ownership has been declining since 1980s. I'm not going to say he said, she said to any parties, right? I'm a researcher. From an objective point of view, both the major parties have been failing young people because we knew these issues have been around, according to my research. So how long would it take to actually acknowledge these issues and act on it? 20 years? 40 years? That's too long.
Can I just take up this point about the path to net zero by 2050? So there's a lot of things that we have to do. We have to transform our energy system, which has historically relied very heavily on coal. So we need to bring more renewables into the system. That's why we're committed to Snowy Hydro 2.0, for example, which will have energy capacity to support 500,000 households. That's why we're committed to Marinus Link so that we can draw on the hydroelectric capacity in Tasmania and bring that onto the mainland. It's why Australia now has 1 in 4 rooftop solar homes, the highest penetration in the world, responding to the incentives that are in place under our government. But what's very important as we make that transition, you say, oh, well, why can't we make that target earlier? That's a very complex transition. And if during the course of that we suddenly stop having reliable and affordable energy, if we start having blackouts, then the political will for this big transformation is not going to last very long. So in government, you've got to manage and deal with lots of different things at the same time. We've got to take Australia through this transformation while maintaining cheap and affordable energy. That's why we've got a careful technology, not taxes approach to achieving that outcome. And of course, you've got to maintain economic growth as well, because that is how you fund roads and schools and hospitals and all the other things.
Catherine, would you mind just holding the thought? Because it does go to our next question. I'll come straight back to you about our next question from Zach Boland.
I'm voting in a federal election for the first time, but I can't help but notice political disengagement amongst my peers who largely intend to vote independent and not with the major parties. Is the recent surge in popularity for independent candidates a short-term trend and a direct response to COVID-19 and economic mismanagement, or a catalyst for a long-term trend that eventually results in Australia developing a multi-party system?
Catherine, because it does go to all the issues we're talking about, whether it be climate, whether it be inflation, whether it be housing, Claire's sense of sort of despair about what the future looks like, and a disaffection with major parties.
Yeah, well, and I think I just want to take Paul up on the point. I mean, this issue, Paul, is that we've had this climate wars occurring in this country for the entire time I've been in politics, and frankly, the party that is in power at the moment, your party, has got the National Party basically holding the country to ransom about climate change. And that is partly why we haven't moved forward in the way that we should do. You know, all of those things, that shopping list that you just reeled off, sound great. But the fact is you've got a political party, you've got Matt Canavan going around saying net zero is dead. I mean, really, like, so anyway, that's... I don't dwell...
Yeah, so it is.
But let's not...
I don't want to dwell on that.
Decided by the Cabinet and committed in an international forum. That is our position.
Yeah, well, let's see how long that lasts if you get back in government. But what I do want to say is that these are the very issues young people are talking about. Climate change, integrity in politics, representation in politics, making sure... So the reason that independents are rising is because there's general dissatisfaction with the government on these issues.
And Labor.
And
they're
if
looking
people,
for outside of the two major parties.
I think that you're not seeing that as much in Labor seats, to be blunt. I don't think you are. So I think people are looking to push us further. That always happens. But I think, you know, the discourse I'm hearing is people are generally... it is in these, you know, with the rise of the teal independents, we are seeing lack of action on climate change, lack of action on integrity in politics, lack of representation, the division that's occurred. They are the things people are wanting a voice on, and the government has failed.
Carol.
That is why they're coming under so much pressure.
I do agree with your point that I think it is both parties, and I actually think that independents are a symptom rather than a solution in themselves. And you do see people, they look at things and they go, well, I don't necessarily identify with either of the parties, and so you go looking to identify with something else elsewhere. What I would say to young people is the most important thing is, you know, teaching you guys, or not teaching you guys, but encouraging you guys in how to think rather than what to think. You guys can work it out for yourselves. You're a really smart, really savvy generation. Read really broadly. I read The Guardian every day. I disagree with 95% of what's in it, but I read The Guardian every day because you never know when there might be a point in there which refines your own view or develops your own view. So I think that there's really important. The other really important thing that I think is you're not necessarily going to agree with your friends, and your friends aren't necessarily going to agree with you, and that's perfectly okay. People can have divergent views, they can be equally valid views, and you can all be equally decent people. And I feel like there's some of that polarisation in politics, which in a sense has driven people away from the major parties as well, because, you know, there becomes that sneering or self-righteousness attached to it, which is actually really unhelpful. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, Siimon, it comes down to messaging too. What is the attractiveness of the messaging of independence? I think you're in an electorate where a teal independent is running, right? What do you see in brand differentiation from the old parties?
Well, I think regardless of either of the main parties' policies, I think no matter what they say, there's a general tiredness about the old system and people looking for an alternative, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. But as a result of the internet, I think there's been a huge fragmentation in people's points of view.
Social media.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the old days, let's say in the 50s, we were getting these messages from a handful of media, and the variety of education on sub-issues was pretty minimal. Now, young people have got this tremendous richness of points of view, and their knowledge is 100x what it was even 20 years ago about issues. So we cannot avoid the fragmentation of points of view and therefore political voting.
Where does that fragmentation lead, though? There are dangers in that too, and you mentioned social media, disinformation. You've been in the United States, you lived through the Trump years, and we saw all that upheaval, but clearly people voted for Donald Trump the first time around to be president, and a lot of people still voted for him in the last election when he lost. So where does that lead, potentially, this sense of dissatisfaction and looking for the circuit breaker, if you like?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, in the case of Trump, and we were in America when he won, and I remember the night, at 11 p.m. the night before, I was watching Fox News, and even Fox News, who was super pro-Trump, thought he had no chance whatsoever of getting in. But it's indicative of just deep dissatisfaction with status quo, business as usual, the same political machinations happening year after year, decade after decade. Is it going to lead to, in places like America, a lot more independence? I don't think so, because it's more likely that you're going to get people who have the ability to speak in broad brushstrokes and affect different generations. That's not an easy skill. Trump, for better or worse, had that ability. He could say, you know, we're going to build a wall.
Salesman.
Huh? Yeah, he's a great salesman. And unfortunately, in the world of mass media, it's often the great salesmen that overcome the rest.
I would like to add a generational difference here. So Trump's vote share, young people, so the youngest generation at the time, so millennials, Trump received the lowest vote share from millennials, right? But the problem was young people not turning up to vote as much to actually impact the poll as much. Fortunately, we have compulsory voting, and because of compulsory voting since 1924, we also have a political culture. And according to my research, younger generations and younger age groups are no different. There's no significant decline or significant fluctuation among there is just ad hoc fluctuations. There's no significant trend or decline among younger generations and older generations when it comes to engagement.
Let's go to our next question from Swan Lau.
Hello. My question is, can we talk about productivity for wage growth in isolation without talking about revenue growth or recovery, in particular our national revenue in exports of goods and services? And when we talk about exports, can we choose not to talk about China? You see, everything is so interconnected if you want to govern effectively.
Yeah, that's a great question, Swan. Very clever. It's a really great question. Catherine, there's so much in that. Sorry. There's so much in that. Obviously, geopolitics with China, which we'll try to get to. But it also goes to this idea and the areas of differentiation between the two parties. The Prime Minister has said that Anthony Albanese is a loose cannon, to use loose unit. I think it was.
Loose unit.
A loose unit, to use his words when it comes to the economy. Arguing for a 5.1% increase on minimum wage during an inflationary cycle. Isn't that precisely what's going to lead to more interest rates, increased inflation, push other wages up beyond minimum wage as well?
Not at all. You know, you have to be able to have money to be able to spend money in the economy, and we're talking about workers who are earning $20 an hour, and we're talking about an extra $1 an hour. I mean, seriously, these are workers who, you know, frankly kept us going during the pandemic, and like. It's not, you know, is Morrison seriously, you know, apart from the fact that what is he trying to appeal to young people by using the word, you know, loose unit? You know, really.
It went past me.
Yeah, is he seriously?
I'm not young, by the way.
My 13-year-old uses it all the time. So anyway, but you know, is he seriously going into this, you know, the polling day on the 21st of May to say that those workers on minimum wages deserve a pay cut? Because that's basically what he's saying. If he doesn't believe that they should, that is exactly what he's saying. Exactly. That is the consequence.
We had the leader of the opposition.
That is the consequence of what he is saying.
He would set wage rates.
He did not say that. Now you just you are verbling him. How about you let me finish what I was going to say? That you are verbling Anthony. Anthony said very clearly that minimum wage needs to keep up with inflation. Now, that should be a bipartisan point of view. It is self-evident. If poor people don't have money to spend in the economy, you know, what do you think is going to happen? And that is basically, you know, people who are earning $20 an hour are not wealthy, and they deserve to have their wages keep up with inflation. That is what Anthony said.
Okay. And so, you know, Siimon said there are no differences between the major parties. Let me tell you one fundamental difference. In our party, we understand that the wealth in the economy...
Poor people should stay poor.
...comes... Catherine, you're talking about verbling. Let's not verbal, right? The money in the economy comes from the private sector. 87% of people are employed by the private sector. So when you talk about a wage increase, that has to be paid for. And overwhelmingly, that has to be paid for by private sector employers. So when you talk about a wage increase, that means a small business person who is worried about whether they can keep their business going, whether they're getting the extra revenue to pay for those wages. The system, it's an overall system, and these are difficult judgments because, yes, it's important that we understand people's need for income, of course. That's why we have a specialist body, the Fair Work Commission, that weighs up these issues and understands that the money that is paid to people in wages has to come from somewhere. Overwhelmingly, it is people are employed in private sector businesses, and they only have the money to pay the wages if they can earn it from their customers.
Don't stage 3 tax cuts have the same impact, though, if you're also going to be forcing up inflation, playing into the interest rate cycle, favouring people who are earning more if you're going to be earning paying 30% up to 200,000. How is that fair, and does it still not push up inflation?
You know, we often get criticised. For not having economic reform. We are committed to a serious tax reform, which is that from 1 July 2024, the great majority of people will pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar as a marginal tax rate. Now, that is a reform that economists identify as desirable because it increases people's incentive to work. And look, again, in terms of the differences between the parties, we are committed to lower taxes. The Liberal Party will always be a lower tax party.
Well, you're not, though. And again, if you want to talk about facts, you are taxing more today than the Labor Party did when we were last in office, when that is an absolute fact. You want to talk about
Go out and ask the Australian people whether they think the Labor Party will be the lower taxing party.
That's not about that. You want to deal with facts. You don't want to deal with the message that you want to put across. But what you have basically just said, in your answer then, is that you are very happy to ensure that people at the wealthier end of the spectrum get to spend and keep more of their money, but you're not happy for people at the poorer end of the spectrum.
We could sit here and have a political debate between the two of you all night, but I do want to hear from others on the panel as well. Caroline?
In relation to anything in particular, or just...
That might be the best answer all night.
I feel like there's a lot in there.
There is a lot in that, but the reality is that we are, regardless of who's going to be in office, in an inflationary cycle. That's also global. Interest rates are going to be pushed up. There is questions of equity and fairness, and whether it's tax cuts or whether it's an increase in minimum wage, they all have knock-on effects. Is this the reality that we are captured by this cycle regardless right now?
I think it is a little bit, and I think, to be honest, regardless of who's going to be in government, it's going to be something that has to be dealt with. It's not like we have an election and it all goes away. The point about it only being $1, I mean, that there is in relation to the one person, but there is a lot of people in this cohort. So in a macro sense, it's actually hundreds of billions of dollars that goes into the economy. So it does have the effect of being inflationary. And my mum always tells me about the 1970s, how her wages went up, like they doubled, and then 2 weeks later, the cost of goods and services doubled. And the fact of the matter is, if you're in a business, the business person has the decision to either, if they can, absorb that cost, but they might have other input costs that are also going up, or they have the decision whether they pass that on to the consumer. And in some cases, they are just going to have to, and that there will obviously then have that inflationary effect. But the other thing is it might be a matter, and we do see this, that if you start having to increase wages, I'd rather take a tiny bit of a hit than have one of my colleagues lose their job. And sometimes it does come down to that, depending on the type of business and the size of the business. When you're going through an inflationary period, you want to have a job.
Do you all feel as if we're chasing our tail at the moment? Cost of living is going up, but then you look at wages, then you look at interest rates, it's sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Hands up, do you feel as if we're just... Yeah. I think cost of living has certainly come to the fore throughout the campaign. Let's go to our next question from Samuel Chu.
Thanks, Dan. My question's to the panel. After missed opportunities in this election campaign to select culturally and linguistically diverse candidates in Fowler and Parramatta, do you believe that more needs to be done to support and encourage minority representation in Australian politics going forward? If so, what do you believe should be done?
Catherine, how does Andrew Charlton from the eastern suburbs and Christina Keneally represent people of the western suburbs of Fowler and Parramatta?
Well, I think the first I'd say is that we do have a really diverse range of candidates in this election campaign.
The question was about Parramatta and Fowler, and diverse candidates were pushed aside so that two people could be parachuted in, and they're not from the area.
Well, I think first I'd say that Christina Keneally is an extraordinary politician, and she will be a fantastic member for Fowler. And Andrew Charlton is someone who will make a substantial contribution to, again, the federal parliament, both outstanding candidates, and there are pre-selection processes that are gone through, and that was the outcome of those processes. But I think, you are right, it does need to be a far more diverse representation in politics. In the 20 years I have been there, there have been more women. We are beginning to see more culturally diverse. The fact that we now have a First Nations caucus within the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party, Linda Burney, Patrick Dodson, Malandiri McCarthy, we're hoping to get Marion Scrimgeour up in Lingiari, is terrific. Sally Situ, I think, will make an enormous contribution. We've got...
Tu Lee would have made a contribution in Fowler. She was pushed aside. So
she wasn't pushed aside. There was a pre-selection process that was undertaken, and that's the outcome of that process.
But the question is why you can't develop local candidates who are diverse and represent very diverse electorates.
Which I think we actually have done, and that's what I'd say. Again, with Sally, we've got a candidate in Swan as well. Again, someone who I think will make a fantastic contribution from Western Australia, as well as a number of other candidates across the country. And I think there is diversity happening. It's slower than many of us would like. I understand that, but I think we are starting to see that.
Paul Fletcher, we had the quite bizarre incident this week with Fiona Martin in Reid, apparently mistaking Tu Lee, who had campaigned for pre-selection in Fowler, and Sally Situ, who is her rival for the seat of Reid. How do we explain that?
Well, look, Fiona has dealt with that, but we've seen a really strong reaction. We've seen a really strong reaction from the Labor Party because they are very sensitive on this point of parachuting in candidates from other parts of Sydney into Western Sydney. Andrew Charlton from his $16 million mansion in Bellevue Hill can't even name 3 restaurants in Parramatta. The big question for Christina Keneally is if she loses in Fowler, is she going to keep living there? I mean, that's a really interesting question.
I think what happened with Fiona Martin and Sally Situ, to be fair, was pretty appalling. I think she could have dealt with it by apologising.
I think people in Western Sydney are pretty tired of being taken for granted by the Labor Party, quite frankly. And the Labor Party has taken Western Sydney for granted for a long time. It's taken Liberal National
Intifar's dying to say something here, and she can't get a word in.
Intifar.
See, that's the problem of representation, which I'm trying to say something. So basically, we have a problem of representation in this country. Right now, it's shameful. It's absolutely shameful, and we're not addressing the question. The problem has been there for a very long time, and this is what people from minority groups, from equity groups, from marginalised groups, from young people, is that how long is it going to take for these problems to not be a problem? Maybe in the 1980s it was a problem. Right now it's a shame. When I live in Canberra, when I look over my shoulder, right, to the Parliament House, do I see any bits of myself? No. And that's shameful. I don't feel represented, and representation is a very big problem, especially among a disenchanted electorate.
I think there's two parts of it. The first is that they should be represented more from cultural backgrounds. The second is, why aren't more people from cultural backgrounds intending to enter politics? So I think what has to happen in addition...
I think they tried in Fowler, but Christina Keneally got the pre-selection.
I think that what should happen over a period of the next 10 years is we should be going into the schools and trying to interest the top people from all kinds of diverse cultures to want to be in politics. Because the question you've got to ask is, are the best people of any culture actually entering politics now? And we've got to dive in and...
That's a very, very good point, actually, Siimon. And let's forget about people from diverse culture. Let's talk about women, right? And we do an incredible job in pushing women from the parliament, right? If you look at just last year, look at the Jenkins Review, right? We do a ridiculously good job in scaring women away from politics. We can't even keep the halls of the parliament, which is meant to be a sanctuary for the rule of law, where 1 in 3 women are being harassed, bullied. Why would anyone want to be in politics where you could literally get raped?
Stan, can I ask you about whether you, in fact, would have any political ambition, whether it's something you could see in your own future?
Well, I think the question, more stands in the sense of representation. You know, I don't, it's not necessarily, so-and-so or so-and-so wants to be in politics. But it's like, I look at the example of, 3 fantastic New York City councillors, Shahana Hanif, Linda Lee, Julie Wan. 3 random examples. They're not Australian. Shahana Hanif was the first Bangladeshi American on the New York City Council. Julie Wan and Linda Lee were the first Korean American women on the New York City Council. For me, what resonates with me is, young women of those cultures, they see this is, they can see themselves in these people. They can see, I'm valued, I'm a part of the multicultural community, and for me, that's what's important. I feel like, representation, in politics, if politics is representative of the people, politics can work most effectively. I think for me, it's not really about, whether I, have an interest, but I, feel valued as a part of the community when I can see the community in Parliament.
Stan, can I just pick up on that point? So with, Gladys Liu as a member for Chisholm, for example, for the first Australian of Chinese background in that seat, my electorate, 19% of people report being of Chinese background, 4% Indian, 3% Korean. That's very typical of many electorates across Australia. And so the more that people from non-Anglo backgrounds can look and see people like themselves in Parliament, I think the better. I'm pleased with some of the examples we have in our party room. I'd like to see more. But what's also important is attracting people into the parties, the political parties, because that's where most of the parliamentarians are drawn from. And we've made some progress, but we've got work to do.
Let's go to our next question. It's a video question from Nick Grant. No relation.
My question is for Paul Fletcher. As a young person who lives in your electorate, I'm disappointed that the Minister for Arts supported the government's decision to increase the cost of arts degrees. I'm looking at a HECS debt of $50,000 to $70,000. How can the government say that they're preparing Australians for the future while also setting young Australians up for decades of debt?
Nick, by the way, is doing a double degree, Paul, in arts and education. But the point is, $14,500 a year, full-time study for humanities, $43,000, $45,000, whatever by the end of that. What do you say to Nick?
Well, first of all, that we're very committed to higher education and are giving more people the opportunity to go to university. This year it's about $20 billion in funding that we're committing to higher education. Now, we have changed some of the funding arrangements so that the cost of some degrees has come down, teaching and nursing, and other degrees the cost has moved in the other direction. And that's quite deliberately designed to send a signal in terms of where the degrees are that are getting the best employment outcomes. So that's been an intentional policy setting. Ultimately, people will make their choices based upon their passions. And price is one factor. It's not the only factor, obviously, but we have made those changes. That's the reason we have made it. Certainly, the arts is enormously important. We've worked hard to support the arts through a very difficult period with COVID, with performances cancelled, venues closed, some $500 million in COVID-specific arts funding. And we're now starting to see performances coming back. We've got a little way to go, but it's going in the right direction.
I'll give Catherine a quick reply to that before we go to our final.
Well, that's okay. We lost 40,000 people who worked in higher education through COVID. Like, that's a huge loss to the sector. We can't rebuild that immediately, but we've certainly announced that there'd be 20,000 more university places.
But the price of a degree is not going to come down.
University accord that's important to actually work through some of those issues about how we rebuild the sector. But I think, again, it sort of goes to what do you value? Like an arts degree, is actually really important and, really important. And so, this sort of constant race to, every single minute has to be about, what your employment outcomes is. What about art and culture and life?
Well, speaking about
really important.
Speaking of employment outcomes, it does lead to our final question. It's from Dennis Agostini.
Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said he always believed in miracles when he won the last election. Does the panel think he'll need another one to win this one?
Paul?
Look, it's a matter for the Australian people. It's their judgment. It sits with them. We're out there every day telling them about our plan for a strong economy and a stronger future. And we're getting a good hearing, but the Australian people will make the decision.
Caroline, I hear that, and I hear the echo of John Howard when he came back to leadership talking about Lazarus with a triple bypass. Is that what we're looking at potentially again?
Look, it has been done before. It has been done before. And the thing is, are we 9 days out? I think we're 9 days out. There is still a long way to go in this campaign, and it feels like every day something eventful happens. What will be interesting to see, one, is what happens, and two, how engaged people are. So there is a big undecided and soft vote at the moment. I take the view that there are people who not necessarily particularly happy with the government. They probably want to give Anthony Albanese the opportunity to prove to them that he can lead the country. I don't think he's given them that choice yet, and that's why they're still undecided. So as we get closer, they will break one way or the other. And I think if Albo doesn't stump up and show that he can lead the country, I think they'll break back to the coalition. But I think it'll be close. I think it'll be a couple of seats either way. I don't see the same kind of hype from 2007 or 2013. I actually see it as quite a subdued sort of election, to be honest.
Catherine, you must still have nightmares about 2019. And remember that image, of course, about ready to lead, and the photograph of the leadership team looking as though they were ready to take the keys to office, and then it didn't eventuate.
Well, I think a couple of things that I want to say is that it's incredibly hard for Labor to win. We've done it 3 times from opposition since World War II. It is always, as a party who wants to govern and does govern in its own right, without reliance on another coalition partner to do so. It is really difficult for us to do that. I think we're really competitive. There is 8 seats we've got to win or pick up across the country, but I do think it's going to be close and it's going to be tough. And I know that Anthony's working incredibly hard to get the message out there, and he's doing an amazing job to do so, and I hope he gets a chance to be Prime Minister. I've worked for him for the 20 years I've been in Parliament. He's probably the best boss I've ever had. He's a fantastic human being, and I hope he gets a chance to be Prime Minister.
Intifar, what you've heard tonight, you've been sitting on the panel listening to the questions, a lot of research into young people, undecideds. What do you think is going to be decisive in the final 9 days?
Well, there are a lot of factors, right? And that's a frustrating answer, but that is like a research-informed answer. There are a lot of factors here, but I have something to say to the Australian people is that whatever you do, please go and vote. And particularly to young people, not saying there's a voting problem in our country, but that when you cast your ballot, think about why you are voting. And when you put in your preferences, think about your preferences as well. Because we tend to forget that we have a majoritarian electoral system, which means that young people who are not really voting for major parties. Over the years, there has been a decline and move to Greens. But then in the majoritarian system, which favours the two-party system, favours the major parties, means that the Green votes go to Labours, right? So what I'm trying to say is that young people and all people, your vote actually matters more than you think. So when you make a decision, please vote and make an informed decision to vote.
Siimon, I know you're an advertising man, so you can bring this in on time, not necessarily on budget, but you got under a minute. If you're in the final stretch and you need a message, you're sitting in where Paul Fletcher or Catherine is sitting tonight. What is a decisive message? What's a slogan that gets you over the line with a week or so to go?
No pressure. No. Look, I think what's got to happen is when you're the leading party, you should do exactly the same thing from a marketing point of view. Because you've only got 9 days out. When you're not the leading party, you have to take a risk now. You have to say something. There'll be no policy differences. You must say something in the marketing that's more special than has been said before. But that takes a lot of balls.
And that's all we have time for.
Good note to end on.
What a note to end on. Thanks to our panel, terrific panel, Intifar Chowdhury, Siimon Reynolds, Paul Fletcher, Catherine King and Caroline de Russo. Thank them. Can I say as well, thank you so much for your questions. To you at home as well for joining in the conversation and streaming us and the wonderful questions we had here tonight from the audience. David Spears is with you next week, live from Melbourne, just days out from the election. The politicians will be there as well. Former member for Indi, Cathy McGowan, and political editor for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Peter Harcher.